The stars were quiet when the world began to laugh at Earth again. The great alien networks broadcasted images of a gray vessel rising from the Pacific shipyards, a narrow spear of steel and light called SVO-1 Aegis, and they mocked it as a relic. From a forgotten age, they said humans still believed armor and courage could win wars in the age of plasma. Suns and void serpents, they called it the toy ship, and the Vare Coalition arranged a parade to watch it fail. Commander Eris Vale watched, the feeds in silence, his face pale in the cold light of the bridge, the young crew behind him uncertain but proud. The Aegis was not born from comfort. It was built from desperation and human stubbornness. They said it was untested, but so was the will of a free world. Eris touched the command rail and told them, today, we show them what faith and iron can do, at the edge of neutral space. A broadcast channel opened, filled with Vare laughter. They demanded a ceremonial inspection. Their envoys entered with shining armor and cruel eyes, measuring the human bridge like traders inspecting meat. One of them smirked and asked, "Is this your mighty vessel?" Commander Eris only nodded and said, "It is enough for the truth." The alien laughed louder, saying truth will not help when metal breaks. Lyra Kale stood near the nav sphere. She was Starborn, born with the strange sight that read the flow of gravity between stars. Her gift made others uneasy, but Eris had trusted her since the first test, flight, and now while the aliens taunted, she whispered that something was wrong. She felt a pull behind the nearby moon shapes moving unseen. Eris pretended calm and let the inspection continue while his hands moved across the console hidden under the rail. The ship's core hummed the secret heart of Aegis, a human Starborn fusion drive that bent probability itself. The Vare ships circling above began to glow on Lyra's sensors, their weapons charging under a diplomatic banner. It was not a parade, it was an ambush broadcast for all to see to humiliate Earth live across the stars. Eris waited for the moment when the first beam would fire, then gave a single word jump. The world turned white. The Aegis tore through folded space, leaving the laughter and the trap behind. The sudden gravity twist threw the Vare formations into chaos. Their beams burned each other instead of the human ship. In the next heartbeat, the Aegis emerged in dark, empty void far beyond the ambush field. Alarms screamed, systems strained, crew gasped, but they were alive. The prototype had jumped further and faster than any ship built by human hands. The bridge filled with the sound of disbelief. Then cheers. Lyra steadied herself, her eyes bright with fear and wonder. She said, "They will call this a coward's escape." Eris answered, "Let them mock while they can. We are still breathing, and now they have to find us again." He knew what would come next. The Vare would brand him outlaw, traitor, warmonger. They would send hunters. They would turn every channel against Earth. But he also knew something deeper had begun. The Aegis was no longer a secret test. It had become a symbol that refused to die quietly. Through the cracked comms, Earth High Command shouted orders to stand down, to surrender the ship before war spread. But Eris shut the channel. The crew watched him without speaking. He said, "The line has already been crossed. We did not choose it. They did. If we run now, we give them the story they want." He looked at each of them, ordinary humans and one Starborn girl, and said, "We will make our own story. One they cannot laugh at." Lyra nodded and began plotting safe routes through the maze of uncharted drift zones, while engineers fought to cool the burning core. The ship floated wounded but alive. The stars ahead were hostile yet full of promise. In distant halls of glass, the Vare flag Lord Serac received the news and smiled with thin rage. He promised to take the human toy apart piece by piece. Before every world watching, Eris Vale did not hear that promise yet, but he felt it in his bones. He stood at the bridge window and whispered to the void. They mocked the wrong world. The ship drifted in the silence between suns, the wounds of the jump still glowing across its hull like fresh scars. Engineers moved in silence, their hands shaking not from fear but from the weight of what they had done. They had broken the rules of the Council and defied an empire, and for the first time in centuries a human vessel had survived an ambush meant to erase them. Eris Vale stood on the bridge, his reflection faint in the cracked glass, and behind him, the soft hum of the Aegis core filled the air, like the breathing of a living thing. He knew the Vare would not stay quiet for long. They would hunt the ship through every lane and shadow until they made an example of him. Lyra was bent over the navigation sphere. Her eyes closed, her fingers tracing invisible lines across the map of space. She whispered that the Aegis had left a trail too bright to hide and that the Veer could follow it easily. Aris told her. Then we move before they finish laughing. Lyra guided them into the fringe lanes, places where old wrecks drifted and time itself felt slower. The Aegis glided through them like a ghost, its crew growing closer and harder with every hour they shared stories of what had driven them to volunteer for an untested prototype. One spoke of losing his home colony to Vair tax raids. Another of seeing his brother vanish into alien labor camps. All of them had come because Earth had stopped believing in itself, and they wanted to remember what it felt like to fight for something more than survival. The captain listened without speaking. He could feel their anger mixing with something cleaner, pride maybe, or the beginning of it. When they reached the mining ring at Pharos Drift, the small settlements turned their signal dishes away, pretending not to see the Aegis. Fear of fair punishment hung over them like fog. Aris hailed them anyway. His voice steady, he told them the truth that the Aegis was not running, that the Vair had already declared war, and that humanity had no choice but to stand together. The miners did not reply at first. Then an old voice crackled over the channel saying, "If you can bleed them, Captain, we will send what fuel we can." The crew smiled for the first time in days because they knew that even fear could bend toward courage if given a spark. Lyra spent her nights studying the strange heart of the ship. She discovered layers of code that responded not to commands but to emotion. The core brightened when the crew's resolve rose during battle simulations and dimmed when they argued or doubted. She told Aris that whoever built this ship must have believed that strength is not just metal, but will. Aris said, "Then we will give it. Will enough for both of us." Soon after, scouts picked up 3 Vair raiders closing in sleek blades. Built for pursuit, they were fast, cruel, and confident. Aris did not run. He turned the Aegis to face them. He wanted to see what his ship could do when the enemy came laughing. He gave the order to ready the gravity lance. Lyra warned that the weapon drew directly from the core and could tear the hull apart. But Aris only said, "If it works once, that will be enough." The raiders charged, beams slicing the dark. The Aegis dove under their formation, its shields flaring like a storm. The crew worked in perfect rhythm, no words wasted, only trust the gravity. Lance fired a single pulse that bent space itself. The first raider folded inward like a mirror, shattering into silence. The second fled. The third tried to lock on, but the pulse wave tore its engines away. Silence followed again. The crew stared at the wreckage drifting around them. They had just defeated a hunter squadron, alone. The news spread fast. Miners and traders picked up the transmissions, sending them through hidden relays. Soon the outer systems whispered about the human ship that refused to die. The coalition called the Aegis a coward's machine, powered by forbidden tricks. The Vair flaglord Serok saw the battle logs and ordered every nearby fleet to hunt the humans until nothing remained. He told his officers to capture the ship, not destroy it. He wanted to break it live before the galaxy. Aris learned of the bounty placed on his name and smiled without humor. He told the crew they wanted proof that humans still mattered. Now they will have it. That night he stood alone in the observation deck, staring into the endless sea of lights. Lyra joined him quietly. She said, "Every jump we take brings more danger, but also more eyes watching us." He asked, "What do you see when you look out there?" She answered, "I see laughter turning into silence." He nodded and said, "Then we keep going until even the silence remembers who we are behind them." The ship pulsed with soft light like a heart beginning to beat, harder, knowing that the war had only begun, and that Earth's toy ship was becoming something else, something that would soon make every empire remember why humans were never meant to be ruled. The Aegis moved through the dark corridors of deep space like a wounded predator learning its strength. With every breath, the crew no longer spoke about escape or surrender. They spoke about finding the next target and making the next strike count. Commander Aris Vale had become a name whispered among border worlds, a symbol that frightened the Vair and inspired the forgotten colonies. Even Earth councils who once doubted him now watched from their marble chambers, pretending they had always believed in his mission while secretly waiting for him to fail. But Aris was not fighting for them anymore. He was fighting for the ones who still believed that courage was stronger than fear. Lyra guided the ship toward the Keth Rift, a dangerous region where stars bled into black rivers of gravity. She said the Vare had built a fuel spine there, a chain of stations feeding their war. Fleets, if the Aegis could cut it, the enemy would stagger. Aris listened and then ordered preparations for an attack that would either prove the ship's power or end it. The crew worked without rest, patching hull plates, loading the gravity lance, coils readying the small escort ships that followed them. Now volunteers from mining fleets and smugglers who refused to bow to the coalition when they reached the edge of the rift. The stars ahead twisted like reflections on broken glass. And Lyra said quietly, "This place remembers pain." The battle plan was simple but insane. Eris would send decoy haulers into the rift, transmitting fake distress calls when the Vare patrols moved to capture them. The Aegis would jump in close enough to strike. Before sensors could adjust as the operation began, the bridge fell into tense silence. The decoys drifted exactly where Lyra had calculated. The first enemy ships appeared sleek and sure, their weapons charging. When they detected no resistance, the Aegis arrived like thunder. The gravity lance fired one pure pulse and space folded inward. A cruiser vanished, crushed into its own light before the others could react. The human escort swarmed with magnetic torpedoes, striking fast and vanishing. Into the fog, the rift itself became their ally. Twisting beams and hiding movements, within minutes the Vare line broke. The fuel stations erupted in silent fire. The Aegis pulled away, leaving chaos behind. The crew cheered, the victory echoed through. Every console, even Lyra, smiled for the first time since the ambush at the ceremony. But the triumph was short-lived. One of the escort ships had taken a direct hit. Losing power and falling toward the rift's core, Aris had seconds to choose between. Saving them and keeping the Aegis hidden if he tried to help the Vare reinforcements would find them. But he could not abandon those who had fought for him. He ordered the ship to dive. The crew obeyed without hesitation. The Aegis caught the crippled escort in its tractor array and began to pull. The weight was enormous. The hull groaned. Every light dimmed. Lyra linked with the core again, channeling more energy through her own body until her skin glowed with pale fire. She whispered, "Hold," and the ship obeyed. When they broke free from the rift, the damaged escort was alive, but the Aegis was bleeding energy from half its systems. Aris ordered power rerouted and went to check on Lyra in the medbay. She was pale, trembling, but smiling faintly. She told him the ship had responded not to code but to his decision. The core had felt his refusal to leave his people behind, and had lent its strength. He stood quietly for a moment, then said, "Maybe the ship understands what it means to be human." Later in the quiet hours, he recorded a message for the border colonies, thanking them for their faith and promising that the Aegis would keep fighting not as a conqueror, but as a reminder that freedom could still burn brighter than any star. Meanwhile, far away, Serac studied the battle logs from Keth Rift, his expression unreadable. He told his officers that the human ship had violated every rule of combat, and yet had survived because it did not think like them. He ordered the relic yards near. The Shadow Sector prepared, saying he would bait the humans with something they could not resist, an ancient beacon from their lost age that still pulsed faintly under the dust. Eris received that transmission from a sympathetic trader who intercepted Coalition chatter, and despite every warning, he decided to go. He told the crew, "If that beacon holds even a fragment of human memory, it belongs to us, not to them." Lyra hesitated but followed him. She said, "The beacon's light feels wrong, but also familiar," Eris answered. "Then we will find out which it is." The Aegis changed course, heading toward the relic yard, unaware that this choice would lead them into the heart of the Vare trap, and test not only the strength of the ship, but the faith that bound every soul aboard it together in a war that had only begun to show its true face. The relic yard waited like a graveyard of forgotten empires, broken hulls floating in silence, half buried in drifting dust. The light from the nearest star, weak and cold, the Aegis slipped through the debris with engines muted and every sensor stretched to its limit. Commander Eris Vale stood at the command rail, staring at the beacon pulsing faintly among the ruins. A soft gold rhythm older than any human living. Lyra watched it too, her voice trembling. She said, "This is not just a signal, it feels alive, as if it remembers us." Eris ordered the ship forward, ignoring the uneasy glances from the crew. They had followed him through storms and fire. They would follow him again, even into the shadow of the enemy. When they reached the beacon field, Lyra guided the Aegis closer. The light grew stronger, weaving patterns across the bridge glass. The symbols were human, old, but unmistakable. Aris whispered that it was proof humanity had reached this far once before. But his triumph lasted only a heartbeat, because the next scan revealed what he had half expected. Fair signatures, hundreds of them, hidden among the wrecks, waiting patient, as Spider's Sirach had known he would come and had laid his trap perfectly. The net activated before the Aegis could pull away. Gravity mines locked the ship in a spiral. The hull groaned under impossible pressure. Alarms screamed through every deck. Aris barked orders, his voice cutting through the panic. Reroute power to lateral thrusters. Brace the core seal sections 5 through 9. The crew obeyed without hesitation. The ship shook as explosions flared outside the viewports. Lyra gripped the nav sphere. Tears forming in her eyes, she said the only way out is through the core, but it demands a trade. A memory of great weight, or it will not answer. Aris stared at the dying lights around them and knew there was no choice. He placed his hand on the rail and spoke to the ship as if to a friend. He offered the one memory he still carried of the woman he had once loved on Earth. The laughter. The promise, the goodbye before he left for the fleet. The moment he spoke it, the memory faded, and the core awakened, in blinding light. The Aegis roared like a living beast. The gravity net fractured. The ship lunged forward, cutting a path through collapsing debris. The crew screamed with effort and fear, but they held their stations. When the pressure broke, they were free. The starfield returned sharp and endless behind them, the Vare fleet scattered in confusion. Aris gasped as the loss of his memory hit him, a hollow silence in his heart. Yet in that silence, something else grew, a cold, calm focus that told him this fight mattered more than any pain he could carry. They escaped into the shadow drift and hid among the ruins of an ancient human citadel. Lyra guided them to its heart, where a massive sealed gate waited, carved with the same Starborn symbols she had seen on the beacon. She placed the key crystal from the core into the slot, and the gate responded with a hum, older than language. When it opened, the crew stepped into a vast chamber glowing with faint blue light. At its center floated a structure like a seed of a star. Lyra whispered, "It is an ark, a forge that can awaken dead systems, give light back to lost worlds." The crew stood in awe, realizing what they had found, while Aris felt only the weight of what it would cost to protect. The moment of wonder shattered as sensors flared again. Sirach's fleet had found them faster than expected. Beams of plasma began hammering the citadel walls. The Aegis scrambled to defend the entrance. Aris shouted orders, and the crew fought. With desperate precision, fighters launched drones swarmed the airlock one by one. The humans pushed them back, but the enemy numbers kept growing. A missile broke through and tore into the lower deck. The explosion threw Aris to the floor when he stood again, one of his closest friends. The chief engineer, Merrick, was gone, lost, sealing a breach to save the others. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Lyra dropped to her knees, whispering that she could finish activating the ark, but it would take time and the enemy would not stop. Aris told her, "Then you finish it, I will buy you that time." He led the counterstrike himself, moving through smoke and sparks until the last Vare soldier fell. The citadel shook as the ark came alive, beams of light bursting through the floor. Lyra emerged with tears on her face, saying it was done. But her voice broke when she looked around and saw the faces missing. Aris stood over the ruins, feeling the ache of loss deeper than before. He had lost memories and now lives, but he refused to break. He told her the Starborn law belief becomes power when acted upon, and we will act until the end. The Aegis lifted once more, engines burning bright, while behind them the ark pulsed like a new sun, waiting to change everything for those who still believed in the courage of humankind. The news of the ark's awakening spread like fire across the broken map of human space, carried by smugglers, traders, and signal runners who risked death. To pass it on, they said the Aegis had found something that could light the stars again, and every soul who heard those words felt a spark return to their chest. At first, Earth councils tried to deny it, claiming Aris Vale had gone rogue, chasing myths, but the people did not listen. The miners, the freight captains, the refugees hiding on the edge of alien patrol lines, they began to gather. They formed small convoys, bringing fuel parts, weapons, anything they could find to help the ship that refused to die. And soon the empty lanes of space began to fill with lights again, each one a promise that humanity was not finished yet. On the Aegis, the crew watched the incoming transmissions with disbelief. Convoys sending coded messages saying, "We are coming to stand with you." Lyra looked at Eris, her voice soft with awe. "They are answering us," she said. Eris nodded, but he felt the weight of it all. Every ship that came meant more lives. He had to protect, and he knew the Veer would strike harder than ever. The enemy had already surrounded the frontier with siege rings, cutting trade lanes and hunting anyone who carried a human flag. Serac wanted to end this rebellion before it grew teeth, and his fleets moved like storms sweeping through the void, destroying everything in their path. Aris met with the new captains who had joined them. Rough voices hardened by work, not war. They sat together in the Aegis hangar and planned. How to survive their small fleet was barely held together by courage and scrap. But Eris saw something in them that no empire could build: loyalty, born of choice, not command. He told them, "We cannot outgun them, but we can outthink them. We do not fight for territory, we fight to remind them that humans never kneel." They trained for days using simple tactics: feints, misdirection, time jumps, hit and run, strikes. The Aegis became the teacher and the symbol, its crew guiding miners and haulers. As if they were soldiers, every failure turned into a lesson, every small victory into proof that belief could shape reality. When the Veer siege ring formed around the Hikara Gate, the only corridor connecting dozens of free worlds, Aris knew this, was where the war would either end or begin again. If the ring held, humanity would fade into scattered dust. If it broke, then the spark would become a fire. He gathered every allied ship in the shadow of a dead moon and broadcast his message across the system, his face worn but calm. He said, "The coalition thinks fear is stronger than hope. They think we will crawl back into the dirt and beg for mercy. They think we have forgotten who we are. Let them learn today that humans do not beg, we build. We bleed, we endure. If you want to stand with me, then stand now. If not, go in peace. No one will blame you." Silence followed. Then one by one the small ships began to respond, their voices overlapping. "We stand, we fight. We are with you until the end." Lyra smiled through tears and said, "They have chosen." The plan was madness. Eris would lead a direct assault through the center of the ring. The volunteers would follow in waves, distracting the heavy cruisers, while the Aegis used the gravity lance to tear a hole big enough for the rest to slip through. If they failed, the fleet would be lost. If they succeeded, they would open the way for every human world still waiting in the dark. The battle began with a roar, beams flashing like lightning. In endless night, small ships darting between giants, the Aegis at the heart of it all, its engines burning brighter than ever. The enemy's fire hammered them from every direction, but the human formations held their timing perfect, as if guided by a single will. Lyra stood at the navigation sphere, her eyes glowing with the light of the core. She felt the pulse of every friendly ship like heartbeats echoing through her mind. She whispered to Eris, "They trust you completely." He answered then, "We make sure their trust is not wasted." The Aegis unleashed the gravity lance, its pulse tearing open a section of the siege ring, entire cruisers imploding. As the field twisted around them, the volunteers rushed through, firing everything they had. The ring began to crack, but Serac's fleet moved in from the far side faster than predicted, their flagships closing in with overwhelming force. Aris realized this was the countertrap Serac had planned to crush not just the Aegis but the hope it carried as the Veer ships surrounded them. Aris felt the tremor through the deck. Lyra said the core cannot take much more power, but he only smiled and said, "Then we give it everything." The human fleet regrouped tighter, forming a wall of fire between the Aegis and the enemy. For hours they fought until their weapons were nearly dry, the gate ahead flickering under the strain of the battle. Aris looked at the stars and whispered to himself that even if they died here, they had already changed the story of what it meant to be human. But somewhere deep in the void, Serac's own flagship was moving closer, carrying the next blow, and the fate of all who had dared to believe would soon rest on one last impossible gamble that none of them could yet see. The Veer siege ring around the Hikara Gate blazed like a living storm, its walls made of fire and ambition. Every alien warship aligned to crush the rebellion. In one stroke, the human fleet fought within that burning circle, their ships small, fast, and full of desperate courage. Aris Vale stood on the bridge of the Aegis, his eyes cold steady, the noise of battle thundering through the hull. The crew moved with calm precision. Exhaustion and fear forgotten. Lyra was pale, her hands pressed against the navigation sphere as she whispered coordinates through the roar of alarms. The gravity lance fired again, cutting through a destroyer, but the energy feedback hit the core so hard the lights dimmed and warning symbols flared. Across every console still Eris refused to stop. The enemy began closing in from all directions, beams carving space into ribbons and fragments of human ships spinning away into the void. Yet each loss bought seconds more for the others to move forward. Eris called to the Allied fleet to regroup behind the Aegis, forming a living wall around the wounded smaller vessels. They obeyed without question. Following the voice that had given them hope, the Vaer ships advanced relentless. Serac himself at the center commanding the flagship Charon, a massive dreadnought twice the length of the Aegis, its hull covered in the bones of conquered worlds. A sudden tremor struck the Aegis as boarding hooks slammed into its flanks. Alarms shrieked through. Every deck enemy soldiers in black armor stormed the corridors. The humans met them in brutal silence, close quarters where every heartbeat mattered. Eris ordered the bridge sealed and took a rifle from the rack, leading his men through the smoke. The fight twisted through narrow halls, flashes of blue fire and steel clashing in shadows one by one. The boarders fell, but more kept coming, their numbers endless, their hate burning hotter than fear. Lyra shouted through the comms that the star core was being jammed by alien dampers. The Aegis was blind, deaf, helpless without its heart. Eris realized they could not hold the ship from the inside. He needed to strike at the source of the jammer, the Charon's control heart deep inside the flagship itself. He gathered a small team and launched in a stealth pod, under cover of debris drifting from the last explosion. Their pod slipped through chaos undetected until they touched the hull of the Vaer flagship. The air inside was thick and cold like a tomb. They moved in silence, weapons ready, guided by Lyra's whisper through their earpieces. The corridors of the alien ship glowed with pulsing veins of light feeding power from its captured cores. When they reached the command spire, Serac was waiting, tall, elegant, monstrous, his armor etched with the names of dead human worlds. He looked at Eris and smiled, saying, "The brave little captain who thinks defiance is a weapon." How quaint. Eris answered that defiance built every world you tried to erase, and then he moved first. They fought without words, a clash of strength and purpose. Serac's blows like thunder, Eris fighting through pain and fury until his weapon shattered. He fell bleeding, but still stared up at the alien lord and said, "You will never understand what makes us win." Serac laughed, saying, "You mistake chaos for courage and pride for power." Eris looked at the glowing floor and saw the pulse of the Charon's blind vein, a conduit feeding the jammer. He reached into his belt and triggered the charge. The deck split open, light and sound. Swallowing the chamber, Serac staggered, roaring, as the blast tore through the ship's heart. The explosion crippled the flagship. The jammer died. The Aegis woke, again its systems flaring to life. Lyra felt it the instant it happened. She screamed his name and turned the core outward. The ship answered her call with raw fury, tearing through the encircling fleet. To reach the dying Charon, she locked onto the signal of Eris's beacon and jumped without waiting for confirmation. Inside the wreckage, she found him broken, but alive, her hands shaking as she dragged him into the pod around them. The world burned. She activated the jump again, pulling the Aegis and what remained of their people into the edge of the gate. When the light faded, the battle still raged, the siege ring closing again, the fleet battered, almost gone. Eris drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering to Lyra that the fight was not over, that the gate must open no matter what. She held his hand and said, "Then we will open it together." She could feel the ship's heart pulsing to their rhythm, as if ready for something more. The crew gathered around, waiting for orders, knowing this was the final hour, the point where legends live or die. Lyra looked at the fading stars and said, "The core wants a living signal, one last link of will and human spirit to awaken everything." Eris opened his eyes, weak but clear, and said then, "Let us give it everything we are." The fleet above them wavered under the weight of alien fire. Every voice on every ship called the Aegis name, begging for guidance. Lyra set the coordinates for the final surge. She felt the memory of every fallen soul around them, the miners, the engineers, the families who had risked everything to stand free. And she whispered, "We are the voice of all of them." The Aegis began to glow brighter than the suns ahead. The void trembled. Serac's remaining ships turned in panic, unable to believe what they were seeing. The human ship rising again, unbroken, unafraid, even at the edge of destruction, preparing to burn a path through the storm. One last time, for the honor of the species they had tried to erase, the Aegis burned like a second sun at the heart of the storm, its hull trembling as the star core reached beyond the limits of design. The wounded human fleet circled close, waiting for a command that might also be a farewell. Aris Vale stood weak, but steady on the bridge, his uniform torn, his face pale but his eyes alive. Lyra was beside him, her hands pressed to the navigation sphere, her voice a whisper almost lost under the rising hum of the ship. She said, "The core is listening. It will answer if we give it a signal strong enough." Aris took a slow breath and said, "Then, we give it the truth that humanity is still here, that we will never kneel again." He opened the broadcast channel to every allied ship, to every broken world that still had ears, and said, "This is Commander Aris Vale of Earth. The enemy says we are weak, that we are finished, that we should accept the mercy of chains. They mock our voices, our hearts, our courage. But hear me now. We are not finished. We are the sons and daughters of every fire that refused to die. We are the builders, the wanderers, the dreamers. We have been hunted before, and each time we stood again. They may destroy our bodies, but they will never erase our name. We are humanity, and we are coming home." His voice carried through the static and reached ships scattered across the edge of known space miners in their rigs, traders on dying engines, refugees hiding in forgotten stations. All of them lifted their heads as if a sleeping instinct had. Awakened, they answered with small signals, bursts of light across the void. Each one a declaration that they still believed. Lyra felt those signals through the core, the pulse of 1,000 wills joining together, and the Aegis began to change, its energy folding into a lattice that stretched outward, binding the fleet in a single living shield. The Vare saw it and panicked. Serok's remaining captains ordered all fire on the Aegis beams struck from every angle, but the lattice absorbed them, bending light and force into shimmering waves. The human ships moved as one. Their paths guided by Lyra's hands, the gravity lance pulsed again and again, breaking through the siege lines like thunder. Aris gave calm, precise orders, his mind clear, every command perfect in timing and weight. The volunteers followed without hesitation. The battle turned from chaos into rhythm, the kind only humans could make when heart and purpose aligned. Serok himself refused retreat, his flagship limping, but still armed, he broadcast across the open channel, shouting that humanity would drown in its own defiance. Aris looked at Lyra and said he cannot imagine a world where courage wins over fear. Let us show him what it looks like. The Aegis powered the lance one last time, drawing from the core's full strength. The deck vibrated as energy built to a level no system could safely hold. Lyra linked her mind fully to the ship, guiding the pulse directly through Serok's position. The blast tore through the dark, ripping the flagship apart in a burst of white silence. When the light faded, the siege ring was gone. The surviving human ships drifted in stunned quiet around the glowing Aegis. Then cheers filled every channel. Some wept, others laughed, unable to believe they had lived through the impossible. The Vare remnants broke formation, fleeing into the outer sectors. Their discipline shattered, their faith in victory gone forever. The Hekara gate began to stabilize under the pulse of the Aegis, the ancient paths across the stars reopening like veins of light spreading through darkness one by one. Dormant beacons came alive across the galaxy, calling to every human world that thought itself alone. Aris sank to his knees on the bridge, exhausted. Lyra knelt beside him, her face pale and tears tracing lines through the dust. She whispered, "We did it." He smiled faintly and said, "No, Lyra, they did it, all of them together." He looked at the stars and saw the glow of the reopened lanes like rivers of fire stretching toward Earth, and beyond the ship hummed softly as if breathing with them. The crew stood in silent awe, knowing they were witnessing the first dawn of a new age. Days later, as repairs began and survivors gathered to honor their dead, the Aegis floated quietly near the gate, a monument and a promise. Aris addressed the fleet once more, his voice calm and firm. "We built this ship to prove that faith still matters, that courage can make metal live. We are not saviors. We are reminders of what humans become when they stand together. This ship will not rule. It will lead by example. Wherever there is darkness, we will send light. Wherever there is silence, we will speak. And wherever they mock us, we will rise again. Stronger than before, Lyra watched him and said softly, "You gave them hope." He shook his head and said hope was always theirs. They only needed a reason to remember it. The stars reflected in her eyes, bright as living fire, as the fleet began to move, forming new paths, new alliances, new futures. The Aegis at the center like a beacon calling every lost soul home. The legend of the prototype that no one believed in had become the legend of a species reborn, and in the quiet after the war, the galaxy finally understood the oldest truth of all, that you can mock humanity. You can wound it, break it, burn it, but you can never make it bow for the human spirit. Was the fire that built the stars, and now that fire was awake again. The stars drifted in silence after the war, their endless light reflected across the metal skin of the Aegis. The ship once mocked as a failure, now shining as a symbol of everything humanity could be. Aris Vale stood at the viewing deck alone, watching the lines of light stretch into infinity, each one a reopened path to a world once lost behind him. The crew moved with quiet purpose, rebuilding, tending to the wounded, carrying messages of unity across the fleet. They no longer called themselves soldiers, they called themselves guardians of the dawn. Lyra stepped beside him, her hair catching the faint glow from the stars. She said, "The lanes are awake again. Signals from Earth are coming through. They call you the savior of the frontier." Eris smiled softly, his voice low. "I am no savior. I am a reminder that when humans choose to stand together, they are unstoppable." The bridge filled with soft murmurs of life engineers, singing old songs as they worked, pilots laughing. For the first time in months, the ship itself seemed alive, humming like a heartbeat that stretched through every wall. Eris felt the vibration through his palm and whispered to it, "You carried us through the fire, and we carried you through doubt. Together we made the impossible happen." Lyra closed her eyes, listening to the echo of his words. She could feel the pulse of the core, calm and steady, no longer burning in rage, but breathing in peace. She said, "The core feels at rest, like it has finally found its place," Eris answered. "Maybe it knows that our purpose is not to conquer, but to create." Outside the viewport, the rebuilt fleets formed new constellations. Hundreds of human vessels of every size, shape, and purpose gathered around the Aegis, preparing to travel to worlds once abandoned colonies, where survivors waited for a sign that hope still existed. The Aegis sent out a pulse of light across the void, a single wave carrying coordinates to every hidden human settlement, and when they received it, they responded not with words but with light, until the blackness of space became a sea of brightness, each spark a promise that humanity would rise again. Lyra turned to Eris. Her eyes filled with something more than pride. "It was peace," she said. "Do you think they will remember this in 1,000 years?" He looked at her, the faint scars on his face glowing silver under the starlight, and said, "They will not remember our names, but they will remember that once there was a moment when the human heart refused to surrender, and that will be enough." She smiled and placed her hand on the glass, whispering to the stars, "Go tell them we are still here." The Aegis engines ignited, not in fury, but in harmony, its wings of light spreading as it led the fleet toward the next horizon. Earth sent a final message that day, a single phrase carved into the silence: "We remember who we are." Eris closed his eyes and felt the words settle in his soul. He knew there would be more battles someday, there always were. But for now, the galaxy was quiet. For now, humanity had written its name into eternity. The stars began to shift as the fleet moved forward, the darkness behind them, closing the light ahead. Growing stronger, Aris turned away from the window and said softly, "Let's go home." Lyra nodded and smiled. The hum of the ship deepened like a heartbeat, steady, eternal. The Aegis vanished into the sea of stars, carrying with it the story of a world that refused to bow, and a people who found strength not in power but in unity and faith that could never be extinguished. The legend would be told across generations: the ship that was mocked, the captain who would not yield, the girl who saw light where others saw nothing, and the fleet that turned despair into destiny. A story whispered by those who still dared to dream of freedom, the tale of the prototype that became the soul of humanity carried forever on the winds of starlight. The end.